Welcome everyone to the second of our Engagements Lecture Series events. I'm Sarah Betzer, together with Chad Wellman, co-director of the Engagements curriculum. We're all here tonight under the auspices of the new college curriculum pilot, and so I want to begin by recognizing the tremendous support provided by the College of Arts and Sciences for tonight's lecture, and in fact for all of our shared work as students and faculty in the Engagements courses. I also want to publicly thank Bo Odom for his organizational acumen and unflagging commitment to keeping the myriad Engagements wheels running smoothly. It's my great delight to introduce tonight's speaker, Artist Mark Dion. From his beginnings, and if we really want to go back, Dion will take us there. He tells us Godzilla was my boyhood idol, but that's a different talk, I think. So if we really want to go back to beginnings, from there, Dion has developed into an artist celebrated as a clear-eyed assessor of the human species, a scientist in disguise, an artist, scholar, and craftsman whose positions fluctuate between a critical viewpoint and an activist standpoint. That's a sort of crystalline recomposition of a series of, I think, really apt recent descriptions of Mark Dion's work. Dion's is an art of wonder, of enchantment, but it's likewise an art animated by the critical scrutiny of institutions charged with world-knowing and knowledge-making. The museum, surely, but also botany, oceanography, natural history, and practices of fieldwork that subtend the arts and sciences. Born in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Dion studied at the Hartford Art School, at the School of Visual Arts, and the Whitney Museum of American Art's Independent Study Program. Based in New York City, Dion has organized exhibitions and public projects throughout North America, from Miami to Nebraska to Seattle, and in Vienna, Monaco, Paris, Antwerp, Belize, Berlin, Maastricht, Dusseldorf, Jerusalem, and in Scotland, Denmark, and Uruguay. And this is just a selection of sites we could mention. Just 2.5 weeks ago marked the opening of a major retrospective exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, Mark Dion, Misadventures of a 21st Century Naturalist. Jill Medvedeau, director of the ICA, recently zeroed in on key aspects of Dion's practice, writing, quote, "His sense of wonderment is combined with an acute awareness of what we risk when we squander our natural resources and contribute to their demise," end quote. For those unable to make the trek to Boston, not to worry, we are very lucky to have a Mark Dion installation here in our midst. And this takes us back to the fact that this is not a first arrival in Charlottesville for Mark, but a return. He was a Ruffin Distinguished Artist in Residence in spring 2015. 2015 installed this major project in last spring. So engagement students and faculty have all had a chance to visit and indeed penetrate the interior of Dion's project, the Virginia Curiosity Shop. And this is the point where we need to pause to give a hearty thanks to Emma Terry, Matthew McClendon, Emma Lazaro, and the Fralin Museum docents who made possible roughly 600 individual visits to the Virginia Curiosity Shop. Could we just actually, yeah. So what about that? What about that Curiosity Shop? On the one hand, it's a modest structure filled with stuff, the ephemera of lives lived, seashells and Barbie heads and flashlights, but carefully, scrupulously organized. We scratched the surface, as I know you began to do in discussion sections last week, and we find that this is work deeply, sensitively, and maybe also hysterically in the sense of it having a sense of humor, deeply, sensitively knowledgeable of the long history of collecting and display, looking back, in this case, to the modern museum's origins in cabinets of curiosities or Wunderkammer that brought together objects of nature and objects of art side by side in an effort to organize, understand, and reckon with the beauty, ugliness, and sheer wonder of the world. For his part, too, Mark Dion trains his eye on the fine line, a line that is sometimes indistinguishable between nature and art, and between the practices of scientific observation and the making of art. This is work that returns again and again to take as its subject, to prod and to probe, the history of science and specifically empirical inquiry. And along the way, Dion and his many collaborators have taken on the role of quasi-scientific observers, looking at and embodying scientific collectives of the past. For decades, Dion's work has been more and less explicitly engaged with the urgent questions facing our planet, namely the relationship of the human and the natural in the Anthropocene, our age of mass species extinction and global environmental crisis. By now, it will have already begun to be clear why Mark Dion is so well suited to speak in our Engagements lecture series. The engagements are courses that take up 4 intellectual sensibilities: engaging aesthetics, engaging difference, empirical and scientific engagement, and ethical engagement. These are courses that together begin to fashion a sort of intellectual map of the college, revealing how scholars in a wide range of disciplines do their work, formulate questions, tackle analysis, reflect, and respond to the world. The College Fellows faculty were delighted to include Mark Dion in our speakers series, in part for the ways that his work slices through these nodes, closing the gap between the aesthetic and the empirical, but indeed touching upon all 4 of our categories. He helps us to consider what is the shape of an ethical question relative to the making and viewing of art? Or what does an ethical question do aesthetically? His work often challenges us to look again at fundamental questions of difference, broadly construed. How are we to reckon with the distance between and entanglements binding the human and the natural? Can those categories even be conceived independently of one another? It is a real pleasure to have in our midst such a thoughtful, reflective, and provocative maker and remaker of worlds. Please join me in welcoming Mark Dion.
Thank you so much. I'm always incredibly appreciative of people who introduce me without referring to the Wikipedia page. So I admire that. Thank you. So I'm an artist. I'm a sculptor. I am a person who works with the field of installation, which is really about the transformation of a space rather than the production of an object. And I also work in the public realm. I do social practice endeavors. So I want to talk a little bit about some of that stuff, realizing that for many of you, this may be the first artist talk you've ever seen. So that's an exciting possibility for me. Let's see. So my work also responds to context, right? It responds to place very often, and it responds to a temporal context. This is a work called The Octagon Room. As you can see, it appears to be a bunker outside, an 8-sided bunker. And it's responding very much to, I've been part of a number of personal tragedies based on public catastrophes, and one of those being the election of Ronald Reagan in 1981. One of those being the second election of George W. Bush, which this piece responds to. One of those being more recent, but I'm not going to talk about that yet. So the time of George W. Bush is a kind of interesting moment for me because my group of thinkers and intellectuals and artists and activists, in a way, retreated a bit. And retreated in a way that was kind of astounding, I think, for all of us because of a certain kind of exhaustion and a feeling of disappointment and betrayal. And it reminded me very much of the way, say, French intellectuals had to retreat during the Nazi occupation. You know, this kind of look inward. And that I saw not only in myself, but also my friends who were very active, say, during the Reagan period. And so I wanted to try to think about a way of interrogating that and even critically interrogating it for myself. And I built this 8-sided bunker, of course, 8 signs representing 8 years of nightmare. And inside, one enters this inner sanctum, which is a little bit like peeling away my skull and looking into my brain, or rather inhabiting my brain, right? And so inside of this is it's almost like a personal prison of your own design. So this talks about a lot of the things that were going on in my life in that time, and also at this moment, a lot of my peers, artists of my age, were having retrospectives and surveys. And they were getting surveys at the New Museum and the Whitney and MoMA. And I was like, hey, damn, where's my survey? And I thought, well, if I'm not going to get one, I'm going to make one as well. So that's what this space is. And unlike a normal installation where there's a velvet rope or a barrier or something like the Virginia Curiosity Shop where you are merely peering through the window, this is actually an interactive space. So people can come in and mess around with the things. There are boxes there that are meant to be opened by viewers. There are portfolios that are meant to be explored. There's a desk full of objects. There are drawers that are books that can be removed. So this is a kind of new territory for me. And you see there's a map that shows all of the various places that Sarah mentioned that I've done projects. It does mean killer frequent flyer miles, by the way. Also, you see there are these portraits of people who have influenced my thinking and my work. Everyone, from P.T. Barnum to Emma Goldman, from Joseph Beuys to, to Jean-Luc Godard, from Rachel Carson to Jacques Cousteau, right? So a whole range of people that in some way inform. It's a little bit like showing your footnotes in a work like this. And I'm trying to create a kind of expansive space for an audience. I don't expect everyone is going to recognize all of those figures, but it also becomes a kind of fun test. How many of these people do you recognize? On the mantelpiece, you see containers of ashes. My gallerist had recently died, and so my response to his death was to burn the entire archive. Little did I know that Bard had a second copy, his copy of the archive, and now you can go there and see my letters complaining to him about getting paid and things like that. And there are also other elements that you might find in a room of one's own, right? So there are keys to all of the different projects I've worked on, all the cabinets and all the buildings. There are the costumes that I often wear because a lot of my work has a performative aspect, right? And so I am very much doing performing a kind of activity, whether that is something like proto-archaeology or orthodox taxonomy or a whole series of things. There are other elements, smaller examples of these works. So it's meant to be a very comical, engaging space, a space that where you could actually take a book off the shelf, sit down, and read it, where you can open drawers. The drawers are marked shells, for instance. You'll open one drawer and you'll see seashells. You open the next drawer and it's shotgun shells. So there's lots of jokes and there's lots of play with the objects, and it invites viewers to participate. And this work was up in public spaces, and at Mass MoCA, for example, for years, and nothing significant was stolen. It's interesting. There are only a handful of things people stole. There's a James Baldwin book people stole. People stole Emma Goldman's biography, but virtually nothing else was stolen. It was kind of an extraordinary experience. So one of the bodies of works that I do are these very close encounters, right? These things where it really challenges the museum. Museums are not really used to people interacting. Museums have spent decades not allowing people to interact. So creating those kinds of situations to see what happens. Very often my spaces, my wonder rooms, and I'm playing very much with the idea of wonder. I'm playing with the kind of material exuberance you find in the Cabinet of Curiosity, the Wunderkammer tradition. This is not my studio. This is not the kind of studio an artist like myself. This is not what I do. This is not, although It's tempting, right? This is a beautiful painter studio at the Porthmeor Studios in St. Ives, right? And St. Ives is in Cornwall, in England. It was a site where there was the great pilchard fishery. So pilchards are like sardines. And for generations, fishermen went out and captured these sardines literally by the millions and brought them to a strange building that was made from, around the beginning of the 19th century, made from old ships and bits of scrap and metal and some of the earliest concrete construction. And they used that space to take their millions of fish and to press them into oil that was then used in streetlights in Paris. And around the 1880s, artists started to come to St. Ives, liking the isolation, liking the light, liking the subject of working with these fishermen together. And so in this building, you had artists and fishermen living and working side by side, including the famous St. Ives School with people like Francis Bacon and Ben Nicholson and the whole series of artists who lived here. And since then, these studios have been developed into utopian, beautiful artist studios. And the fishermen, of course, they overfished the pilchard fishery to the point that it broke. So those fish never came back. Millions and millions of fish. They broke the life cycle by taking too many of them. And that pilchard fishery has never recovered and never will recover. This space became the home for a handful of fishermen who are still doing crabs and other things. And the artists, and eventually now, there are no more fishermen there because there's no fishing industry there, and there's just the artists. So I wanted to come in and make an installation that still spoke about this moment when there were fishermen, when there was, and there still are fishermen there who can talk about their industry that doesn't exist anymore. And I think it's a really interesting kind of ecological parable in a way. So they can use my space that I've constructed, which is in some way this archive of all of the fishing techniques from the 19th century to today. So from making wicker and weed baskets to using soccer balls as floats. And fishermen occupy this space, take the public through, and describe it. But this space is also a kind of fantasy space. It imagines, what if the fishermen and the artists were not two groups of people who occasionally rub shoulders, but what if it was the same person? Right? So this is called the maritime artist. So it's a little bit of a play on Karl Marx's idea that one could be a fisherman in the morning and a doctor in the afternoon, right? That this fisherman can actually be a painter. And you never see his painting. Its back is toward you as a viewer, and no matter what angle you are, you can't quite see it. But you see the studio embedded with the fishing studio as well. In a way, also imagining that maybe this thing that we think about is, at this moment, this transformation of this building to artist studios is also not permanent. It's also not inevitable, that it's also something that could go extinct. There's no reason to believe that this will last longer than the pilchard fishery. And like the fishery itself, it has its own material culture, right? It has its own remarkable equipment and methodologies and resources. And I love the sort of play of the color and the formal aspect between these two things. I also come from a seaside town, so this kind of the vocabulary of these materials is really personally reminiscent, and there is this kind of abomination for me when fishing floats become restaurant decorations and things like that. So I love the idea of trying to put them back into that context and to allow them to speak in a somewhat authentic way. I also work a lot in public space, right? And public sculpture, public art is, I think, the realm of art where the greatest crimes can be committed. I actually don't have to say that in Charlottesville in the way I have to say it in many other places, perhaps. But so I'm always interested in looking for a model for public art. So if it's not monuments and it's not plop art, art that is insensitively placed without reason or a appreciation of context, what could it be? Where could we look? Of course, we could go to the cemetery and look at that and gravestones and strange things like that. We can also look back in history at the idea of the folly, right? The folly are these structures that are meant not so much to have a practical function, but to make meaning, right? To symbolically function, to create a situation, right? And that they are buildings that are discursive. They have a sense of humor. They relate to place, but they can also be out of place. They speak to other traditions, but they are clearly about a misunderstanding and sometimes an intentional misunderstanding. They reach back. So could we go back and wrestle the model of the folly away from the aristocracy, right? Can we take this model, this idea of a structure, a diminutive structure that makes meaning, that is about creating a situation that has a kind of comedy about it and a lushness, and I think yeah, that could be interesting. So, as follies are very place-based and time-based and contextual, I have to talk about my follies in the same way. They are always related to a location. So this is the location. This is actually on the border between the United States and Mexico in San Diego at the Tijuana-San Diego border, one of the most radical borders we have in this country, one of the most radical spots on the border. And there's an area called the Tijuana Slough Nature Preserve, and this is an area that was set aside partially because it's on the border, because it also had been a landfill, a garbage dump. It was used by the Navy to test bombardments during the Second World War period, and it is not developed. And at the same time, it's adjacent to sprawling California suburbs. So there are always kids in here riding their BMX bikes and park rangers chasing them down. There, of course, is on the border. There are people coming across the border illegally, and there are people stopping them from crossing the border. It is adjacent to the area where the Navy teaches its helicopter pilots. So you cannot be in this area without 1 to 4 helicopters overhead, sometimes with Navy SEALs dangling from them. So it's not the most restful nature preserve you've ever heard of. But if you are a fish who needs to swim upriver, this is your best spot. The Tijuana River empties into the Pacific Ocean here. If you are if you're a bird migrating, this is a very important place to rest. If you're a bird who needs to lay an egg on a beach, this is your best shot on many miles on both sides of the border. If you are a garbage-eating raccoon, possum, or skunk, this is where you sleep it off in the daytime. So all of these animals are shoehorned into this place, this landscape of mischief, right? This place of illegal crossings and policing and surveillance. And so I wanted to use the architecture of mischief and make this building that tries to be invisible somehow. It's sited on a beautiful bomb crater, which is absolutely full of wildlife. And how you see this piece is you give the parks person, you give her your ID, she gives you a key, you walk 1.5 miles out, which means none of my friends from New York saw this, and then you open the building, and it kind of opens like a transformer, and instead of mischief, what you find is a mecca for birders, right? This is a place that everything bird watchers love is here. It has lists and charts and graphs and photographs and maps and recording influence and a watercolor set. Of course, there's optics and all of these things that are just mean birder has gone to heaven on this incredibly sighted blind where they can watch all of the water birds coming to this spot. You can stay as long as you like. There is a hall of fame of people who have done a lot for birds, people like Rachel Carson and Marjorie Stoneham Douglas and Roger Torrey Peterson. There's this frieze of birds. It looks like, like Elliot Porter, like these incredible birds in their wild environment, even though they're dead birds in dioramas, it doesn't matter. There's a chart in case you want to build a bird. There are x-rays of raptors that have had problems there, running into cars, helicopters, or being shot at. So it is this incredible place discourse on avian issues. And as I said, my friends in New York couldn't see that, so they wanted one themselves, and I made them the Urban Wildlife Observation Unit. And that is set in Madison Square Park, which is the park on 23rd Street, across from the Flatiron Building, which probably has the biodiversity of your parking lot out here, right? So I manned that with an incredibly talented and sharp DJ who was probably the most ignorant person of the natural world I'd ever encountered, right? So as a park ranger, he couldn't tell you anything about nature, but his job was to bring you into the space, right? So you could have an encounter with our optics and our recordings, and we even made a natural history museum diorama with rats and roaches and pigeons and the kinds of things you'll see in New York. And there's a library of birds in New York, and there are, microscopes and spotting scopes and binoculars. And if that's not enough, we also made the Urban Wildlife Observation Unit field guide, which has entries for things you'll actually see in the park, like grass and dogs and squirrels and rats, and all of which have an incredibly interesting natural history, and all of those organisms have a natural history that we are bound to, right? They cannot be separated from us, and we cannot be separated from them. So it's a very interesting way to rethink what a field guide could be and what nature could be. And I'm always in a struggle to separate our idea of nature from our idea of wilderness, right? Because that's not the way we mostly experience it. But my job is to go to a place and to find this thread, right? What is it about this place that makes it exciting, interesting, different? What is it? Is there something that a pair of outside eyes can appreciate about a place that maybe it's so experienced by the locals so commonly that they don't see it anymore? So that's why it's nice to bring someone else in. And so I had to go to Essen, Germany, this former coal mining area, an area that has tremendous problems with hydrology because of the history of mining, and I wanted to work on an edge of the land and the sea, or land and the water. So I went to a large marina in the bitterest cold February day, and there across the expanse of ice, there's a group of birds out there, and I have my guide with me. It's 8:30, 9 in the morning, and we're walking around, and we're dying of cold. It's freezing. We're practically hypothermic. And we see there's a building, and out of that building, it looks a little bit like a temporary construction office. But there's a chimney, and there's smoke. And he says, I think we could get coffee here. And so we walk up to the door, and we open the door, and out billows cigarette smoke and roaring laughter. And we walk into this place. The walls were probably once white, but they're like caramelized with years of smoking. And there's a bar, and there's pinup girl pictures behind the bar. And there's tables with large men, and they're all drinking schnapps and beer and slapping each other on the back. And it's 9 in the morning. And I think, what is this place? And they say, oh, this is the Fisherman's Club. I said, the Fisherman's Club? When does fishing season open? I said, usually around mid-April. So let me get this right. These guys get together every day in their club, and they tell these stories because of their relationship with this animal. And I was like, okay, I know what I'm doing in Essen. I want to make a club like that, but not for machos, for dandies, right? And so I found this oxygen tank. This used to pump oxygen into the sewage treatment plant. And the workers, the metal apprentices at the sewage treatment plant are helped me make this thing because they're so excited not to be welding pipes together. They put a lot of energy into it. And you see, they made me a turret, and they made me a hobbit door, and they made me these windows that open up, all so we could realize the Amateur Ornithologist Club. So the Amateur Ornithologist Club is a great location where gentle folk can come and discourse on the avian world, right? And you can have your picnic there, and you can eat off of bird-themed china. And of course, you can peruse our library of field guides, and you can borrow the optics. There is a desk for an attendant, and she will help you, introduce you to the art of bird identification, and of course keep track of all the things, and lend you and show you how to use binoculars and spotting scopes. You see there's a frieze of the names of people who've done a lot for birds, have done a lot for our culture of birds. But in the end, it is a club, so it is still about drinking and smoking. But you can only drink gray goose and famous grouse and wild turkey, cockspur, parrot bay. Needless to say, you can only smoke larks. And of course, it's Germany, so there's just wonderful kitsch, right? And I'm always have my eye out for kitsch, and the way that the discourse on nature is domesticated, right, through these products and talked about. As nature leaves our everyday experience, it comes back in these strange surrogates. So everything in this space is about birds. It's about our projections, our fantasies, our hopes for birds. Another project, I was invited to come to the city of Folkestone. Folkestone is a city on the Channel between Britain and the continent. On a good day, you can easily see France. It's not far from the White Cliffs of Dover. It's a place that once had a very robust fishing industry, but that has been pretty much annihilated by overfishing. It's a city that was once this great vacation place for British people. Before they discovered Ibiza, they went to places like Folkestone, right? Before there was train travel and air travel, Folkestone has amazing, wonderful, large hotels where people like, the Prince of Wales would bring his mistress, and people like Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells had summer homes in Folkestone. And of course, Folkestone fell on very hard times when British people decided no longer to vacation in their own land. And there was an effort to bring people back to Folkestone just to see what amazing bones this city has, what incredible architectural gems. So they started the Sculpture Triennial, and I was invited to the Triennial and spent time in Folkestone. And I also come from a faded seaside town, so I was a little sensitive to what I might see. And what I found was that people in Folkestone had something very peculiar I'd never run across. They hated seagulls, like despised them, and were vehement about it. And you couldn't walk into a shop without people having a conversation about how awful seagulls are. And I love gulls. I think gulls are beautiful and smart, and they have incredibly flexible behavior. And I realize that people hate gulls because some people love gulls too much, right? And they teach these gulls bad habits, like they feed them. So gulls begin to associate people with food, and they begin to develop cleverly around that. So there's a gull who understands how the Tesco supermarket electronic door works. And she goes into the store whenever she wants, and she takes a bag of chips out, and she brings it outside and opens it up, and all the gulls come, and they understand, when it's fish and chip day, and everyone's coming out of the fish and chip shop. And so if you come by at 65 miles an hour, you can have a good chance of knocking people's French fries out of their hand, and then they all come, and it seems like they're laughing at you, but they're not. And so gulls have a problem, and it's a PR problem, essentially. And so what gulls need is a mobile gull appreciation unit. So the mobile gull appreciation unit travels the city of Folkestone, and we go to different sites, and we try to convince people with almost evangelical energy that gulls are amazing, and to know gulls is to love gulls. And gulls have been studied by ethologists for such a long time that while we may not be able to speak gull, we can tell a lot about what gulls are saying to each other. And we know a lot about gull interaction, behavior, body language, calls. And so we can't teach you how to speak gull, but we can teach you how to understand gull. And so what we found out in the course of doing this was that we actually didn't have to convert a lot of people, that the gull haters were this noisy minority. They seem much bigger than they actually were, maybe like the Tea Party or something. Seems like there's more of them than there actually are. And what we found out is that there's a lot of people who really like gulls, right? Who had stories of raising gulls, of saving gulls, of disentangling gulls from fishing line, of feeding gulls, of finding gulls that had rolled off their roof and bringing them up. And so we also, of course, made a mobile gull appreciation unit, a guide, which kind of tells you a little bit about this life of gulls. Okay. I'm going to show you. I was going to decide if I was going to skip this one or not. Okay, this is a hard one. This is Schloss Graveneck. It is it's a castle in Austria. This was a Gothic castle that at some point in the 19th century, the owner thought it wasn't Gothic enough, so he made a neo-Gothic castle out of his truly Gothic castle. And this is what it looks like now, which is very Disney in a way. And it's also surrounded at that time by elaborate French gardens. So very formal gardens in which it's kind of like nature volume 10 all the time, right? Nature is always expressing at its best. And so what you don't have here is a sense of the picturesque, like in British garden style, or a sense of nature as a process, right? Like things being born, things dying, things giving back their energy. That whole cycle of nature is missing. So I was invited to do something here, and I thought, I want to reintroduce the cycle, even if it's only symbolically. There was a hedge, which you see here. You see my ruin that I constructed, which is very much in the vernacular of Follies, is in the middle of a circular hedge. That hedge used to be a very low box eider hedge that was around a fountain. The fountain was hit by lightning, and they let the hedge grow until it became a chamber, like a circular room. And this is it was quite a beautiful thing. The only unfortunate thing is all the visitors to Schloss Graveneck seem to think that this was the outdoor restroom, and it's not. So they wanted me to help deal with that problem as well. So I constructed this broken tower, and you approach the broken tower through an opening in the hedge, and there you see a window. And through that window is a diorama in the language of natural history. And it's a diorama that reinforces this idea of the cycle of nature. It is Bambi dead, Bambi returning his nutrients to the earth for the next generation of forest, and for all of the organisms that take advantage of that. The invertebrates, the fungi. I work a lot on ideas of the diorama. I find the diorama a very compelling bit of the language of natural history. This is the Arlen Mountain in Norway. The Arlen Mountain is never warm. This is the Arlen Mountain on the hottest possible day in August, right? It's above the tree line, and it's on a vast road structure that went from Bergen to Oslo, right? The main road of Norway. Norway, as you all probably know, has become incredibly wealthy because of the North Sea oil reserves, right? So it's been tapping oil for decades now, and that oil is nationalized, so it doesn't go into the pockets of a few people who are head of the corporation. It doesn't go into family pockets. It's spread throughout the nation, and the profits for that, which are astronomical, have been used to better public life in Norway. So through that, they've gotten new roads and new ports and new airports and new opera houses and new schools and new hospitals and all of this kind of infrastructure that benefits the Norwegians and will be there long after that those oil fields are dry. So this road that goes across from Bergen to Oslo, it goes over mountain passes. And it's even the snow removal technology in Norway cannot keep that road open all year. So they started to find alternatives to the road, which meant building tunnels. And they built massive tunnels, including tunnels that are 24 kilometers long, right? I mean, really just incredible. So they found a way to keep this road open. So what do you do with the old roads that go over these mountain passes, that skirt beautiful fjords, that pass glaciers and glacial ponds, go over miles and miles of gorgeous tundra? They said, well, let's turn this into the national tourist road. So people from all over the world can get in the coach and travel on the tourist road. They said, that's great, it's beautiful. This landscape is unforgettable, but that's not enough. Let's invite the most forward-thinking architectural firms, young firms, bold firms, forward-thinking firms to do all the infrastructure, to do scenic overlooks and rest stops and gas stations and hotels and all the other things you need on a highway. And they did that for 10 years, and they won lots of architectural prizes. Lots of new firms were kicked off with this being their first major project. The architecture is incredible and bold. And when that was done, they said, that's great, but that's not enough. Let's introduce art. This is, by the way, the Department of Transportation, right? That's who's the commissioning body. So that's how far we are from our way of thinking here. And so they invited Louise Bourgeois to do a project, Fischli Weiss, and myself to do projects. And they brought me to this amazing site high up above the tree line in the Arlen Mountains. And I said, are you crazy? You want to fuck up this landscape with a work of art? And I had to think, like, how can you do something important here and not destroy this place, right? So I spent a long time reading and thinking and looking at Norwegian culture and spending time there. In Norwegian mythology, and Norse mythology in general, there is this very strong place of the underworld. There's a lot of commerce between the underworld and our world, as there is in classical mythology. So I wanted to construct a way of getting into that underworld. And it just happens to be an entrance that's exactly my height, which most Norwegian men are not. So some revenge in there somewhere. And then you pass through about 30 feet of darkness, and then you find yourself in a darkened chamber looking at a diorama. And that diorama depicts a cave. It's a cave with stalactites and stalagmites and glittery walls, and it looks a little bit more like a cave from the first seasons of Star Trek than a cave in nature, but that doesn't matter. And then in that cave is a vast collection of material culture, starting at the bottom with Paleolithic and Neolithic things, the beginnings of domestication and agriculture, the Viking culture, of course, the influence of the classical world onto Northern Europe, beginnings of course, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and industrial scale agriculture, going up, of course, to today, to now, to right now, to iPhones and things like that. And conspicuously atop this, of course, is a very large sleeping bear, a bear who is, despite the fact that the environment on the Arlen Mountain and the environment along this road is very pristine, it has most of the ingredients that you would have in the historical ecology of Norway. There are two things missing: bears and wolves, right? The two organisms that we cannot coexist with, the two organisms that we see as a threat, the two other organisms at the apex of the food chain that we cannot tolerate side by side. And so our bear here is waiting for this phenomena known as civilization to just pass, to come to an end, so she, like the wilderness itself, can reemerge in a sense. This is a drawing for the largest and most complex work I've done. This is called the Seattle Vivarium. And the Seattle Vivarium was done for the Olympic Sculpture Park, which is a sculpture park right in the middle of the city of Seattle. And I was invited to come in and think about working in this kind of space, which it was a new space. It had been the site of a petroleum transfer station. So a lot of the developers in Seattle thought that this was too untouchable, too polluted land to actually build on. The Seattle Art Museum went in, they tested the soil, they found out it's not as bad as we thought. They bought it, and they decided to make this sculpture park right in the middle, right in the heart of the city. And they asked me to do a project there. I became really interested in spending time in Seattle, which is an incredibly interesting place. I mean, one thing about it, of course, is that the population of Seattle are amazingly environmentally and ecologically literate. They start from a very early age, and they know a lot about their surrounding environment and about the historical ecology of the place. And if you spend time out in that ecology, you see primary forests, temperate rainforests that have never been cut. You know, I come from New England. I never saw a forest that hadn't been cut 4 times. These are forests that have all the ingredients still intact, right? But they are rainforests. They get more than 100 inches of rain. So that energy bound up in a forest would normally be leached out to sea, except the energy is captured by the plants themselves. by the vegetation. And when one of these giant trees dies, it begins to release that energy. And the next generation of forest is very fast to grow right on top of those trees. These are called nurse logs. So I wanted to take a nurse log from the forest surrounding and bring it into the heart of the city, and like an ambassador in a way. And I worked with foresters, ecologists, environmental educators, the timber industry, the people who are destroying these very last forests, were very happy to give us a tree. They said, tell us what tree you want, where it is, we'll helicopter it in. So we didn't want to work with them. We didn't want this to be a greenwashing project. We went to the national forest. They said, we love the idea to get a tree out of the national forest would take paperwork going to Washington, D.C. and back to Seattle, and it would come out no. So we found that the Seattle watersheds are protected areas, but they also have an education mandate. And working with them, we found a tree. We knew exactly the day that this tree had died. You know, when people think tree in Seattle, they think big, right? So this is a 160-year-old western hemlock, the state tree of Washington. We brought it into the city, and here you get a sense of where that sculpture park is. It's really in the heart of the city. And around it, I constructed this purpose-built greenhouse. And this greenhouse's purpose is to allow this nurse log to do what it's supposed to do, to release its energies, and for the next generation of forests that are already seated in the tree itself to grow from that. And every aspect of this building is about replicating those conditions that this tree comes from. We know a lot about the temperature, the humidity, the light that it gets. The ceiling of this building is green because we're trying to duplicate the color spectrum that exists under the canopy. So I hate this picture because someone put a damn garbage can in front of my sculpture. I mean, I just can't, like, what are we thinking here? Anyway, and here it is from the side. You see it's also built with this very forced kind of Bernini perspective, right? This kind of Bernini folly perspective where you enter into the small tip and it's much bigger than it seems on the outside. Not only is it bigger, it just has a very different kind of environment. So you enter through this vestibule. There you see the beginnings of this frieze that, again, talks about the names of people who have influenced the thinking around this work. There's a cabinet that shows some of the elements of where this tree comes from, what kinds of things we found on it. There's a board that thanks all of the many people, the scientists, the community people, the arts people who helped. And then you enter the space itself, and again, it seems much bigger than it looks from the outside. It's certainly much bigger than the point you enter it from. There's all of this apparatus that makes this tree do what it's supposed to do, and that's all very flagrant. It's really like in your face, right? We have to recycle the water from the roof because the city water has too much chlorine to support a lot of the fungi and a lot of the other organisms. It is like being in the belly of the whale. You know, it's loud because the building itself is regulating it as it goes. If it gets too dry, the misters go. If it gets too hot, the vents begin to open and the coolers go on. And of course, walking into this space, it smells different, right? It sounds different. There is the tree with no separation between you and the tree. The tree is this kind of, it's right there. And all of the things that live on and around the tree are right there. So this is it on the very first day when we have these tiny little pathetic ferns planted there. This turns out to be a spa for ferns. So these ferns come in like this, and then within a couple months, they're 5 feet high, and we have to replace them with the pathetic ferns in the park and give them a little spa time. And so this is something. This is not a science experiment, and you let it go. This is something that is extremely managed as a garden, right? And like all gardens, it is the concrete aspect of a philosophy, right? It's meant to illustrate something in very particular. There are these tiles done by local wildlife illustrators that depict a lot of the things you will see in, on, and around the tree. Some you won't see because they're microscopic, and some you won't see because we don't have everything. We don't have all the elements of a forest. We don't have woodpeckers, and we don't have chipmunks, and we don't have a lot of these things a lot of the vertebrates that really make this all possible. And here it is in the city. You see it with the Michael Heizer, Roxy Paintree, Ellsworth Kelly, that creepy Space Needle thing. Okay, I have time for exactly one other work. So I'm going to talk about the confectionery cabinet for Buffalo. This was done for the city of Buffalo. Buffalo is a really interesting city architecturally. Of course, there was, in the early part of the 20th century, a World's Fair in Buffalo, in which great new architectural experiments and architectural technologies were introduced. It is where President McKinley, of course, was assassinated, leading to the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. It also has a lot of wonderful architecture that exists now by people like Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright and all of these amazing people, and it has a lot of that level of architecture that it destroyed, because as soon as the building went empty, Buffalo bulldozed it, and it, as a lot of cities did in the 60s and 70s. So my wife and I, Dana Sherwood, great artist, you should look her up. She makes banquets for animals. We went to all of the local bakers, and we commissioned from them one of the buildings from the World's Fair, so a folly, one of the buildings, one of Buffalo's architectural treasures that still exists, and one that they destroyed. And we put them in this vitrine outside of the only remaining building from the World's Fair, and we let them rot over the course of the exhibition. So this is the buildings in the state of decay. So over an entire year, these wonderful confectionery marvels like this fall into disrepair, and literally like within hours, this piece began to significantly transform. And people can see it throughout the entire year. So some of the builders, of course, were more in the amateur, we usually make Carvel birthday cakes kind, and some were very accomplished, and some took on these amazing challenges. Of course, Buffalo is an extremely cold place, so very soon also things froze, and there was no transformation of this material for a very long period of time. I think I'm going to stop right there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.
Wow. Well done. That was excellent.
I had a lot more talking about different things, but that was good.
So we can Thank you so much. That was just brilliant, and it covered so much of your work for those who may be familiar with some aspects, but not others. So thank you. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Adrienne Ghaly. I'm one of the new fellows teaching in the new curriculum. And I think what I'd like to do, actually I think the best thing to do is to open the floor for questions, because I'm sure with such a thought-provoking talk, you'll be bristling with them. Yeah. Oh, hang on one second. How this works, I should say, is that we have microphones. So if you could wait for the microphone. There's someone down here. Oh, okay. Someone up there, yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. Really interesting talk. My question is, to what extent have you seen an impact of the work that you've done? I know that you mentioned here, and also some of the things I've read, is that one of your stated goals is sort of influence and sort of change conceptions of culture and stuff like that. To what extent do you feel like you've impacted that? I know we've seen in some of the examples, maybe in other examples, or really what it means and what the impact of your art has actually been.
Okay, I think impact is a difficult thing to measure, and I think it's especially a difficult thing to measure if we're talking about art, right? Like, could you say, Mr. Picasso, what was the impact of Guernica? It's a really quite a hard thing to measure in that way, and I think that's it's always kind of frustrating when people want to put art into certain kinds of measurable estimates in a sense that that's not really in a way how art functions. I think there's a couple of different ways I would want a work to function. For something like the Gull unit, of course, is meant to play with a kind of language of converting someone, right? To convert a gull hater to a gull lover, right? So I suppose something like that could be measured, but I think a lot of the other work is not necessarily functioning that way. Very often it's about promoting kinds of values for people who might share those values rather than trying to convert people to those values in a sense. And I think that's quite an important thing, because it's very easy to feel isolated and that you are one of the only people who thinks that wild things in wild places are important. There's no evidence in the general culture that many people think like that. So that I think that there is this kind of way that work can also kind of promote and buttress some of these ideas. But also, I think the work often problematizes information in that way. Art is not education in a straightforward way, and it's not information in a straightforward way. So that also makes it very difficult to, put the values of assessment on it.
Hi, okay. What urged you to choose Virginia as a setting for your work, The Curiosity Shop?
Well, that's a good question. I think, in a way, Virginia kind of chose me, in a sense, that I was invited here to be the Ruffin Fellow, and that means being here for a semester and interacting with students and interacting with the place and dealing with the place, and certainly the sort of vernacular of the building and the materials inside the building are very much a response to that. But also, I think that it's a kind of challenging work to have here, in a sense, because there's not really very much of a template for this kind of way of thinking about art, and certainly not this way of thinking about art in public space here. So if you think about other things that existed in that, with that job, they're very conventional in a sense. So this was, in a way, I thought this was a very, it was meant to be kind of challenging piece to kind of wrap your head around.
Hello. So obviously your work deals a lot with strategy of what you're trying to convey. How much do you let improvisation come into your work too when you're in the progress of creating a piece?
Not that much. I mean, really, a big part of the work for me is the early stage of being in a place and researching, and I keep notebooks, and they're really precise, and the drawings I make for a piece are pretty much what the piece will end up looking like. And so I think that's one of the things I miss as someone who's not a studio artist. The studio is this place of discovery for artists, and often you learn about what you're going to be doing 3 years from now from the mistakes you make today. And I don't really have that kind of opportunity in a way, partially because of the practicalities of how you do these things, and then I'm always up against a time schedule and a budget problem. And so there's not as much room for exploration and for experimentation than I think you would have as a studio person. I feel that missing in a way, but also I'm just that kind of the kind of artist who, I don't really improvise and riff. I really know pretty much exactly what I want to do, and I do it. Yeah.
Hi, my question comes from my engagement discussion section, and we would like to know if you always intend your work to be ambiguous and who your intended audience was for the Virginia Curiosity Shop, if you had one.
I don't think, no, I don't always intend it to be ambiguous. Some works, as you saw, are very, I would think, pretty didactic, pretty straightforward. But I think the Virginia Curiosity Shop is something that is not straightforward. And what it's engaging in is a kind of information about things and a kind of belief in that things can speak in a strange way. So it's meant to appear to be a very casual presentation of stuff, right? But it's meant to reward careful viewers who will see within it themes, right? And those themes are things that go all the way back to the Wunderkammer tradition, to the Cabinet of Curiosity tradition. So there are things that you would find in, say, the tradition of still life, right? So there's allegories, and there's there are things like the senses and the seasons and the ages of humankind, and all of these themes are kind of woven in. But if you're not a careful viewer, you're not going to get that. But I still think you'll get something. So, I definitely don't make my work for only people who have PhDs in art history. But I do want there to be like an entry point. At the same time, I do want it to function in many, many different layers.
Before you were, over here. Before you were invited to different countries as well as cities to do these public art installations, how did you get your foot into doing public art? And was there some kind of impetus or something that started you on that path towards public art?
Well, I work in public art, but I also continue to have a life as an artist who shows in galleries. And I think for me, that's also really quite important to continue to function in that conventional world of galleries and art museums as much as in public. I think you get different things out of working. I know a lot about the audience who's going to walk through gallery doors, and I don't know a lot about the audience that's going to encounter a piece in the public realm, and that's a kind of really exciting thing. So I always started working on both of these at the same time, and I was connected to a number of curators, including Mary Jane Jacob, who's a curator who's really kind of a pioneer in the realm of social practice. And she, and also Anne Pasternak is another person I worked with very early on, were people who really had this kind of personal war against what they called plop art, this idea that you would take a decontextualized sculpture and kind of just put it somewhere, and really thought that public art could be this realm of more kind of civic discussion. And so I worked with them on very different kinds of public art projects. So with Anne, we worked on a project that was in every Sunday for a month in the Hartford Courant. We had the entire back page of the first section, and we curated a number of artists who would take those pages and talk about kind of social issues in Hartford. So not exactly what most people think about when they think about public art. And with Mary Jane, she created an entire exhibition called Culture in Action, which brought a lot of different artists to bear on the notion of what public art could be outside of essentially sculpture outdoors, which is what it meant up until that moment, pretty much.
Hello, thank you for being here tonight. I was wondering, as I was looking through the Virginia Curiosity Shop, how do you decide what goes into the shop? Do you make a list beforehand, or do you have to see and feel the objects to decide?
It's a little bit of both, but there has to be some degree of serendipity. As someone who spends a lot of time looking for things, the most unsuccessful thing you can do is take a list to a flea market, because flea markets don't really work like that, right? They are about maximizing the impact of what you actually can find, and in that way, you have to have some degree of flexibility in terms of your kind of search image for what you're going to find to embody this. So I have kind of general categories, but I can't look for specific things. But it's important. It's a sensibility. So I work a lot with other people who help me make my stuff. So I work with people who can sculpt. I work with people who are carpenters and builders. I work with people who are painters very often. but it's hard to find someone who can shop for you, right? So, because it's all about a kind of sensibility, which, like any other kind of expertise, you build up over time. So, like, you know, I'll have 10 hammers, but only one is the right hammer for this project, right? So you try to talk to an assistant, like, which is the right hammer? Like, you know, you describe the scenario. And so it's the one that's made probably around 1935. How do they know which one that is? And that's one of the hardest things. I can't find people to shop for me, but I can find people to do all these other things, because it really is about a refined sensibility.
We have someone who's been very patient down here.
So I've noticed throughout your works, you either directly cite your inspirations through either putting their names on the installation or drawing a lot of inspiration from local mythology or culture. So I was wondering if you did it purely as an educational point, or if you make a point of being transparent with your inspirations, and if you had any opinion on that.
I think they're accessible. I think that they are kind of. I tend to be, you know, even pieces like the Octagon Room, where I'm literally showing you who are some of the people who have influenced my thinking around this. I try to be pretty transparent about a lot of where this work is coming from, and I guess as one approaches it, it depends very much on the body of knowledge a viewer brings to it, in a sense. As you know, in terms of what are some of the references. Very often there are quite overt references to other artists and to thinkers that I think people can plug into pretty easily. I mean, in some cases, I literally put their picture on the wall.
Hello there. So my question for you is, every one of your artistic creations seem to have some spiritual character at its core, from the bear that'll sleep until the end of days to the botanist or the dandy ornithologist. Did you happen to have a sense of person or character that inhabited the Curiosity Shop, or was it more vague?
No, I think I have a really good idea of who, because, you know, one of the elements of the Curiosity Shop is I'm trying to give viewers one of my, is a sense of my experience, which is in shopping for things, which very much is about thwarted desire, right? So I often find myself stopping in strange places in the middle of nowhere and finding a store which seems to have everything I've ever wanted, but there's no indication that the store will ever be open again, right? And so that sense of wanting more is wanting to have a deeper encounter is part of that. And also the same thing happens, of course, when I run into a store where there is someone there, but it's clear that the store is just an excuse for a kind of pathology where they have no interest in selling anything anyway. So they are hoarders, but in order to allow themselves to be hoarders, they become sellers, but they're not really sellers because they don't want to sell anything. And I don't know how many hours I've wasted making piles in stores like that for people who will not ever sell them to me.
Okay, so on a lighter note, my discussion group wanted to know what the most expensive object in the Curiosity Shop was.
Darn. I don't know, actually. I mean, it's not even the way I kind of buy things. What I often do is I'll just kind of put everything in a pile and try to convince them to price the pile, you know. So I don't know if I could actually say what the most expensive object is. I think it's probably it's probably a bit of furniture, but I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I wish if we were there walking through, I could probably tell you. And I keep pretty detailed notebooks on what I buy and how much it costs.
Hello. First, I want to thank you for coming here and speaking, but My question is more, have you ever ran into roadblocks in putting up your art shops? And what I'm referring to is mainly like during the 1930s, I know that especially when arts pertaining to politics, that there were a lot of restrictions for artists back then where they would put up something relating to communists, and at that time period they literally took it down, and that had that came into like a lot of the influence that the funders have of like the art project. So I wanted to know if you had like, and have you ran into any of those roadblocks before?
I think you're asking a little bit about censorship issues, and one of the things is to be able to walk away from a project. If you're working in public art, you're often working in a situation of compromise, right? And very often your work is whittled down to a point where you barely recognize what you started with. That is absolutely not the case here, by the way. I mean, there were blocks in the beginning of just getting a project like this that is so unconventional, funded and cited. And of course, as probably everyone in this room knows, there are a lot of complications for doing anything here on campus. But we were able to, actually, I should say Emma was able to figure out how all of this could work. And so, but I think as an artist, you really do have to know what is the tipping point when you're working on a project and it is compromised beyond what you want it to be. And you have to have the courage to be able to walk away from a project like that. I've never had a project sort of censored late in the game, but part of the trick is also to make a project that is politically powerful without people understanding that it's a project that's politically powerful until it's too late. So that's a kind of game that you have to play, and so I think that's. I think that some of the projects that you're talking about are legitimately censored, and some of those projects are also a bit game playing. When Diego Rivera puts Lenin in his mural for John D. Rockefeller, you kind of know something's coming down the pipeline, right?
So I have a question that actually comes off of that excellent question, which is that it strikes me that your work is sort of always facing in two directions. It's always looking both to the wondrous, the age of discovery, colonialism, and it's also looking to globalization maybe now, like the lost, the forgotten, the soon-to-be extinct, whether it's the Herbert Hoover doll, which was one of my favorite items in the Curiosity Shop.
That was a donation, actually.
That was a terrific donation. I hope he or she got a tax deduction for that donation. So I guess my question is, could you talk about why the Cabinet of Curiosities feels so appropriate, or sort of politically appropriate, or kind of intellectually appropriate for the moment in which we're living? Thinking in these sort of having to sort of look both ways.
I mean, I do see, I see the modern age as bookended by these two sensibilities. One is the so-called age of the marvelous, right? When we have these eccentric collectors, and I think it's, the Curiosity Cabinet is very different from the 19th century museum, right? It's not a national imperial endeavor, right? It's something else. It's very idiosyncratic. That's not to say it's outside of colonial endeavor. It's at the very beginnings of that endeavor. But there is also this kind of sense of, for Europeans, of this world being so much bigger than they ever imagined. And there is this sense of wonder and the marvelous around trying to figure out what that means and what these things are and who these people are and what all of this is. So you do have this kind of, that sense of the marvelous in the beginning of the modern era, and now I think we have this sense of essentially melancholy as those things that seem marvelous, the corals, the shells, the animals, the cultures, are vanishing, and they're vanishing largely because of the trajectory that Europeans introduced to the world, whether that's the industrial agriculture or capitalism or colonialism or any of those things. So that's, to me, that these bookend what I think about as the modern era. Of course, I'm prematurely ending it, maybe, but maybe with a kind of sense that it would be nice if there could be something else that could evolve that would be positive. I don't really see it, but
that the bear could wake up.
Yeah, that the bear could wake up. Which the bear waking up means that we're all gone. So that's not entirely positive. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Devoutly to be wished for some of us, I think.
Yeah,
that,
exactly. Yeah.
Maybe we have time for one or two more questions. Do we have any people who are feeling brave but have been waiting and working up their courage?
I just wanted to know if there was a significant meaning or purpose to the repetition of objects in the Virginia Curiosity Shop, like the vases and busts, or if it was just a way to categorize similar objects.
Well, I think that's exactly it. If you think about early modern collections, they are very much about they're about kind of having a Noah's Ark sensibility, right? You want two good examples of everything. The mechanism is encyclopedic, right? And it's based on the idea that things are not dynamic, right? And then in comes evolution, and you realize the meaning is not produced by having different species. The meaning is produced by variation within a species, right? That's the mechanism of evolution. And so then having things that can be compared, that can be compared, becomes more valuable than having individuals like in a stamp collection. And so I think that's kind of part of the dialogue that's happening. And also it's speaking a little bit to, collectors don't collect disparately usually. They collect in groups, right? They're interested in, in busts, in paint by numbers paintings, and so there's also that. Unless, of course, it's an undisciplined collector, which I've also done work on. The undisciplined collector, the person who has the compulsion to collect, but just cannot pin down what it is he wants to collect.
All right, we have one more. Okay, let's let this be the last question.
Okay, we in our discussion, as you just so recently mentioned, we noted some colonial overtones in cabinets of curiosities in the past. And so we wanted to know your thoughts on that and how that affected your creation of the Virginia Curiosity Shop.
Yeah, I think that, I think that in many ways the Wunderkammer are kind of one of the first material voices that you have to a European colonial endeavor, right? It's one of the first kind of things that we have. It's not a museum. It's not a national collection. It's not an imperial trophy room or any of these other things that evolve a little bit later. And so you begin to see, this European capital imperative, and I think that in some way it's interesting and important because it happens without direct relationship to either economics or science in a way. So it has sort of one foot in a strange kind of like Hermetic tradition in a sense, in religion and mysticism, and it's very much still kind of quite idiosyncratic. It's not kind of making an imperial argument in that way, but nevertheless its roots are coming from the same thing, the same kind of horrific endeavor. It's really this first articulation of this in its kind of infancy. So it has this kind of weirdness. I don't think that you could say that cabinets of curiosity are ideological in a sense, but they are interesting to study because I think they are the beginning of this imperative.
All right, thank you very much. Those are excellent questions, and thank you so much for